I'm going to introduce, first of all, Kate Hudson, who is the General Secretary of CND, is also a writer on contemporary politics and a university teacher as well. Kate's going to speak about the histories and contemporary practices of CND for about half an hour.
Thanks very much, Andrea. And just to let the rest of you know, Andrea and I have just discovered we were both at the same Greenham Common event in 1982, I think it was, when 35,000 women surrounded the base to protest against the imposition of nuclear cruise missiles in Britain by the United States. The Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament was founded in 1958. It was founded 13 years after the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Partly because for quite a long time many people were under the illusion that it was necessary to use the bomb to end the Second World War. Many people didn't realise until later that in actual fact the Japanese had been trying to surrender prior to the bombing, but the US wanted to use the bomb in order to assert their dominance in the post-war world. But by 1958 there was huge public concern about nuclear weapons, in particular and primarily at that time because of the impact of nuclear weapons testing. And this led to a massive upsurge of local groups and popular opposition to the impact of nuclear weapons testing in the atmosphere. So those of us who are a bit older will remember all the issues about strontium-90 in the milk and the poisoning of our children and so on. So it was primarily those health and environmental concerns which led to the founding of CND in 1958 and the start of what became a phenomenal radical development, the Aldermaston Marches. Aldermaston was the scientific establishment in Berkshire where the nuclear warheads were being researched and developed. So the first focus for the new movement, CND, was to march to Aldermaston. And from 1958 into the early 60s, the annual Aldermaston March became a focus for radical protest. In fact, not just for anti-nuclear protests. Somehow those demonstrations, which comprised eventually hundreds of thousands of people, became a way of articulating all kinds of radical social protests. And if you think of the kinds of things that were happening in the late 50s, the crumbling of the British Empire, independence movements, the Cuban Revolution in '58, social realism in the arts, the first wave of working class people coming out of university and so on. There was great social dynamism, and CND gave expression to it. And if you can see the crowd there are a lot of young people, there was a lot of jazz music on the marches, beatniks, unorthodox sexual behaviour at night, and all these kinds of things. So it was really a vehicle for social change. And many of the social movements which we know today have their origins in either CND directly or the radical climate which CND helped generate. And that's another view of the mass rally in Trafalgar Square. So you can see the scale of popular concern there about the bombs and about the testing. Now, these types of photos that I've been showing you to start off with show kind of mass mobilisation, popular mobilisation in a public space in London. But at the same time, there were the developments, or further developments, of non-violent direct action. People who felt it wasn't enough just to go and march on the streets, but they wanted to do something more direct and more directly challenge the power of the establishment. So one of the first episodes around CND this was at the end of the first Aldermaston March. You can see buses waiting to take people home and all that sort of thing. At Aldermaston, a group of direct action protesters decided to stage a sit-down at Aldermaston. You can see there they said, "We want to see the director." You can see, I can't remember the name of the priest in the foreground, second from the right. The woman there is Pat Arrowsmith, who went on to become jailed 11 times, in the cause of peace and so on. So that was the origins of that wing of the movement. And one of the things that we've seen in CND over the decades is the way that the, let's call it more establishment ways of protest, you know, like ordinary demonstrations, like lobbying MPs, like, you know, writing to the Prime Minister, working with the trade unions and so on, which we do, has always been accompanied by the non-violent direct action trend as well. So it's a kind of an embracing of many different methods. That's part of our ethos. Again, in the early 60s, this is one of the big demonstrations. I've put that in to show you that fantastic papier-mâché mask. I mean, there were many, many artistic expressions on those demonstrations. I think some of the ones in the 60s against the Vietnam War had sort of massive full-scale puppets and so on, you know, sort of 10 foot high. So very much a drawing together of the artistic and cultural expressions as well as the political. This is a sort of smaller scale example of that as well. This is one of the great anti-cruise demonstrations in the 1980s, a nice homemade cruise missile there. Very typical of the types of people who've traditionally gone on CND marches, not people who just come along and pick up the CND mass-produced placard. People bring their own homemade banners, placards, artefacts and so on to express their opposition. Greenham Common, of course, which was in the 1980s. In the early 80s, it was clear that the Americans wanted to put nuclear cruise missiles in Britain and Western Europe. Mrs. Thatcher, who was Prime Minister at the time, accepted that. Some of you look old enough to remember this sort of massive upsurge of popular opposition to nuclear weapons, because at the time we felt that we were going to die. That was a very, very genuine and widely felt fear, because the purpose of putting these missiles in Europe was that the US and the Soviet Union would fight their war in Europe, and we would be the sacrificial lambs. So 30 years ago next month, a number of women marched from Cardiff to the Greenham Common Air Base, which is also in Berkshire, American Air Base, with no particular intention in mind other than to protest. But when they got there, they decided that they didn't just want to go home. They were going to stay there and prevent it happening. And it became the focus for probably the world's most famous women's peace camp, which lasted in major form until the late 1980s, but actually didn't completely pack up until around the year 2000, because there were a small group of women who decided they wanted to stay there until that base was returned to common land. And it wasn't enough just to get rid of the missiles, that it must return to common land. And in around about 2000, they did eventually go home because it was returned to common ground and the base was completely closed. And on the 3rd of September this year, there was going to be a commemoration in the Greenham Common Peace Garden, which is a fantastically beautiful garden, which is there to commemorate the peace camp. But if you look at the background on the fence behind those women there, you can see things tied on the fence. I mean, those aren't very elaborate examples, but it was a big feature of those protests to tie homemade banners, knitting, children's pictures, all these kinds of things, because the message was really very much about life. You know, we want to preserve and maintain life, and also to live in a different way. It kind of, in some ways, also moved beyond just the anti-nuclear argument. That's another mass day of action there. The balloons and things. I don't know if any of you remember the time when the women actually broke into the base, I think it was on New Year's Eve or something, and danced on the top of one of the missile silos. That's a very famous picture. That's when cruise missiles were eventually removed. So they didn't stop them coming, but they did see the back of them, and getting rid of cruise was, well, considerably driven by popular opposition to it. But while the camps were taking place, there were also camps at other bases, at Upper Hayford, Molesworth. Greenham was the most famous, and the others were less famous and also mixed. But nevertheless, people did stay there for many years. But while the camps movement was going on, again there were mass mobilisations organised by CND in central London. The largest one, which I think was in the autumn of 1982 or 3, that had about 500,000 people on it. And that was the largest demonstration in British history until the demonstration on February 15th, 2000 and whatever it was, against the Iraq War. So you can see the kind of impact that CND had in terms of political messaging and mobilisation. Again, that's examples of the CND symbol. For those of you, which of course is now recognised internationally as a kind of peace symbol, but in its origin it was created for the anti-nuclear movement, for CND. If you wonder how it arrives at that position, you know, how it comes to be like that, the artist Gerard Hudson created it from the semaphore symbols, this being N and this being D. So it's a very simple thing, but extraordinarily powerful. And in terms of branding for our campaign, well, you couldn't pay for something like that, really. It's absolutely fantastic. During the 1970s, the movement sort of broadened out in some respects. It was during that period that the environmental issues, sort of green movements and so on, began to develop. That's when we started to do campaigning against nuclear power. And of course, sort of in the post-68 moment, the development of the big festivals, the big music festivals, this was again something which CND was very involved in. And if you, this is Glastonbury, obviously, if you see there at the top, you can see the CND symbol. And Michael Eavis organised the Glastonbury Festival in aid of CND for many years. Now, sadly for us, he's moved on to things like water aid and so on, which are very important. But CND was synonymous with Glastonbury for many years, and in fact Mid-Somerset CND branch was responsible for organising quite large parts of it. But in spite of the fact it's no longer entirely for us, we still have a presence there. This is our marquee, or one of our marquees last year, and you can see in we produce these lollipop symbols, and we get kids to come along, and adults do it as well, sort of paint or draw in the white spaces on those placards, and it's a very, very popular thing. This year we had a graffiti wall, which people could graffiti on as well. Just to reinforce the sort of music links, remember the band Madness. This is sort of dropped off the bottom, but it says even Madness thinks it's madness. So this is an advert we did with the band Madness. Of course, Soaps joined CND after his first child was born. So very much linking on the musical side there. We also, in times when it was less easy to have a mass mobilisation, worked out how to attract media interest, because of course obviously it's not an issue that gets into the media that frequently. Often we feel that there's some kind of obstacle put in our way, but having a strong visual image is something which we find useful. This was, well, you can see it's in Parliament Square, candles in jars to illustrate the CND symbol. That's been a very popular image. More recently, in 2007, we did a projection on the side of Parliament, no Trident